Welcome back to Fast Politics, Anna.
Hi, nice to see you.
So, I wanted to talk to you about the really good reporting you're doing on MAHA. First, first, I see you making the MAHA face.
Yeah.
First, explain to us, for everyone who's not completely read in, what MAHA is.
MAHA is the Make America Healthy Again movement, which began as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. kind of trying to link his longtime interests and causes with those of the Trump campaign when he suspended his campaign and started supporting Donald Trump. And now it's kind of an organizing principle for how he talks about what he's doing to HHS as HHS secretary. There's also a MAHA coalition whose CEO is Bigtree, who's a longtime anti-vaccine activist. He was the
Right.
communications director for RFK's campaign. And that group that he's now the CEO of was co-founded by him and RFK. So it's sort of a organized political movement and also an idea.
Explain to us a little bit about what MAHA has been up to, because they've been up to quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, what Kennedy specifically has been up to, obviously, at HHS is vastly cutting services there and reorganizing the whole agency kind of in his image, So he talked about this at a press conference yesterday, but autism surveillance is now going to be under this group called, or this agency called the Administration for a Healthy America, I believe is what it's meant to be called.
Mhm.
That is the result of coalescing and cutting all of these other different agencies. And then, of course, MAHA, beyond Kennedy, has also been super involved in sort of promoting these goals and then also occasionally objecting to things that Kennedy says. For instance, when he says, that an MMR vaccine might be a good idea to prevent measles, which he said a couple times sort of here and there, they
Right.
will be kind of as a group pretty vocally upset about that. So it's an interesting dynamic.
So we have a really bad measles outbreak.
We
Haven't
do.
had anyone die of measles in about a decade. Now we've had two children under 5 or under 6 die of measles in pretty rapid succession. They were in Texas. They were this Mennonite
Yeah.
group, and they were anti-vax. RFK went down there. He talked to the parents, and they were sort of ushered into this world of MAHA. And a bunch of MAHA doctors also talked to them, and they were sort of told there's going to be some kind of investigation, but they were sort of pushed to believe that perhaps some of the children's hospital treatment hadn't been sufficient,
Mhm.
despite the fact that these were children that, had they been vaccinated, would not have died.
Certainly the case of the first little girl who died. Yeah, they were brought into this kind of children's health defense sphere
Yeah.
and were given a children's health defense being the anti-vaccine organization
Hmm.
that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. founded and was the chairman of the board until he left to run for president. But yeah, given the idea that that their child died as a result of a medical error rather than from measles, which all evidence points to her having died of measles. And from what I've seen from the email blasts and stuff that Children's Health Defense is sending out, they are making the same argument with the second child.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of pressure on RFK to be normal and say that vaccines work, since he is the head of a major part of the federal government's health administration. And he sort of explained to us sort of what he does.
So Kennedy is trying to, in his response to the measles outbreak especially, is trying to straddle two sides of a fence that are basically impossible to straddle. On the one hand, he does not seemingly want to alienate his longtime allies in the anti-vaccine movement. On the other hand, he doesn't want to seemingly give the impression that as a representative of the federal government that he's telling people not to get vaccinated. So he did this sit down interview with CBS News, right? And he
Mm-hmm.
said, I'm just going to quote him directly. He said, the federal government's position, my position, is people should get the measles vaccine, but the government should not be mandating those. He's also tweeted, the most effective way to prevent the spread of measles is the MMR vaccine. And he tweeted that after going to Texas to comfort the family of the second little girl who died. However, at the same time, he's also promoting non-evidence-based treatments for measles, like clarithromycin. I don't know if he's promoted vitamin A.
But that's a
I'm not
real
sure.
thing. Yeah.
Right. So there is now evidence that kids are going to the hospital with vitamin A toxicity because anti-vaccine groups tell them that they can treat measles with vitamin A, which you cannot. So he platformed these two physicians who have promoted non-evidence-based treatments for measles, in addition to also making these comments about essentially saying that he thinks the MMR vaccine should be available to those who want to get it, but that it shouldn't be mandated. And this is a super tricky line to try to straddle. It's angering his allies in the anti-vaccine movement. It's not seemingly convincing folks in the mainstream who are familiar with kind of what his rhetoric has been prior to being a government official.
Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think he's trying to thread that needle?
Well, one of the senators who voted in favor of his confirmation, Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, who is a physician, said, I'm going to be on him, was basically like, Mr. Kennedy and I are going to work together to make sure that he promotes evidence-based treatments. And so it's pretty evident that both within HHS, possibly, but more in the Republican Party, there is some desire to have him not say things that are not true and that could be dangerous.
Right.
This could also be and this is the first time I've ever said this with Mr. Kennedy ever, he could be using some degree of common sense here, I suppose. Uh, that's entirely possible. But it has created a pretty curious situation, and it's unclear to me how people who might be undecided about whether or not to, for instance, give their children childhood vaccines, like how they're receiving these comments.
Tell me what else RFK is up to.
Right. So he had a press conference this week, as we're talking on Wednesday, that was specifically about this new report from CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report that shows that autism rates appear to have gone
Right.
up
Right.
again, right? And so he called a press conference. I want to say that this was his first press conference as HHS secretary. I might be wrong about that, but I'd have to check to talk about this apparent increase, I should say, and I'll explain why I'm using that word, in autism rates. And before this, he also said that we are going to know more about the causes of autism by
Yes.
September. He specifically
How,
said September.
what is happening in September?
So I have to
Besides
say
that
this.
fact that this is completely full of shit. But,
Yeah, this is
right.
not how
2 weeks,
science
maybe
works.
2 weeks. We'll know in two
Right.
weeks.
I certainly have it in my calendar on September 1st to see if we've figured out the causes of autism. But basically, Kennedy is saying that HHS, under his direction, is newly looking into data and science on autism and is going to have more conclusive answers about the causes of autism by September. In this press conference yesterday, as we're talking, he made it pretty clear that he is going to claim that, quote, environmental factors are the causes of autism. He rejected the
Right.
idea that autism has a genetic component, which it does, just scientifically. It does. That might not be the whole story, but it
Science.
does.
Wait,
Yeah,
science. We're going to bring
right.
science into this. That has no place here. Go on. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, he rejected the idea that there's a genetic component to autism. He also made it very clear that he does not believe something that many scientists believe, which is that the autism rates are getting higher in part because autism surveillance and detection is getting better. So one of the
Right.
things that happened in this study, for instance, is that more autism was detected among non-white kids as opposed to white kids. And you could very easily say, well, yeah, that's probably because surveillance and detection is getting better for historically underserved groups who are typically
Mm-hmm.
left out of medical research, unless you're Robert F. Kennedy Jr., in which case you would say, no, the increase is real and it is unrelated to better surveillance and detection. This is just a steady increase that's going up and up and up. So that is what he believes. And so it seems pretty evident that he's going to come back in September and say that he has found that, or that CDC or HHS or whatever have found that autism is indeed caused by environmental factors. He seems to be kind of teeing up that golf ball now.
I personally really, really the one, and again, I have no appetite for MAHA. I think anti-vax is stupid bullshit. But I do really think that environmental factors are responsible for a lot of bad stuff. So I'm curious, this is one of the biggest polluting administrations ever. It
Right.
plans, I mean, all Trump wants to do is get rid of regulations. If Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says this is all from, you know, toxic dumping, or won't that get put him right in collision with Trump world?
Yeah, which is why a cynic would conclude that he might come back and say autism is caused by environmental factors that are not, for instance, fracking, pollution, dirty air, dirty water. But yeah, you would think that if you were a proponent of making America healthy again in its truest sense, you would want to do something about, for instance, like childhood asthma rates, exposure to lead paint,
Mm-hmm.
stuff that really does harm children, making it possible for people to afford medications more easily, stuff like, asthma inhalers and EpiPens that can be out of the reach of
Yeah.
a lot of uninsured families. Like you would think that that
Yes.
would be, you'd
That's
think
what
that
I
that
would
would be a
think.
big part of the approach. You would also
Yes.
think that you probably wouldn't be making these incredibly deep cuts to HHS, Health and Human
Right.
Services.
That's what I would think too.
You would think that. You would think
But
that. That would be a very logical thing to think. So that's not what's happening at the moment, and it could be that Mr. Kennedy comes back in September and he says, autism is a complex condition that is the result of genetic and environmental factors, and hey, it turns out this is really complicated and it needs more study, and we're gonna put more money in it, and also we're gonna rehire people, at all these HHS agencies who have been laid off or fired, and, who knows, maybe that's what's gonna happen. It's, April? As we're sitting here right now, so I suppose a lot can change.
is there any evidence to support the idea that RFK Jr. would do something like that?
Not at the moment, but, I am, of course, an optimist, and I
Mhm.
believe that, the Kennedys have such a long history, and I'm not being snarky here, of public service as a
Right.
family, so maybe, it will be in his heart and in his interest to take up that legacy in a more direct way than he has done.
Just give us a sort of a sense of where RFK Jr. is. What's he going to do until September? Sort of what's on his docket.
Right. So we know a lot from what he tweeted and what he shared before he was confirmed. He's gotten a little bit more circumspect, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Since becoming HHS head. So I want to read this tweet that was widely circulated that I believe was from October of last year. Yeah, October 2024. So before he was confirmed. And the tweet was, FDA's war on public health is about to end under the new Trump administration. And then he listed all these things that would no longer be whatever policed, cautioned against. Quote, this includes its aggressive suppression of psychedelics, peptides, stem cells, raw milk, hyperbaric therapies, chelating compounds, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, vitamins, clean foods, sunshine, exercise, nutraceuticals, and anything else that advances human health and can't be patented by pharma. If you work for the FDA and are part of this corrupt system, I have two messages for you. Preserve your records and pack your bags. And of course, since being confirmed, he's had these pretty extraordinary and kind of combative appearances, where he talks in a pretty denigrating way about FDA. In his press conference yesterday, he said, that on the autism question and elsewhere, scientists would be able to follow the science in a way they haven't been able to do prior without being, I think his word was gaslit. So it's pretty clear that he has a strong interest in what I would call alternative therapies, and he's also talked a lot about wanting to root out what he's called corruption at these agencies. So,
Mhm.
CDC, NIH, FDA. It's worth pointing out again, I've said this a million times in various ways, but, HHS is a huge agency. There are a bunch of
Right.
other departments in it that are not these three. It's one of the biggest, or if not the biggest agency in the federal government. RFK sits over the Office of Refugee Resettlement now. There's a bunch of other stuff
Jesus.
that you don't hear him talking about in quite the same ways because his focus does seem to still be on places like CDC. But, I mean, he did tour the Navajo Nation, I believe last week, and talked to them about like public health and food practices there, though he didn't talk about potential cuts to Indian health services. So yeah, it seems like he's going to continue being focused pretty narrowly on these few agencies that he sort of has been for a lot of his career, rather than maybe taking a broader view of his like overall purview at HHS.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Thanks for having me.